The gun barrel was cold against her ribs, and she did not look at the man who held it. She lay in the red dirt of the arroyo with her left side opened, and her blood going dark into the caliche, and the shadow of the man named Vas fell across her and did not move. Two others sat their horses at the arroyo's lip, and the sun caught the metal of their rifles and made small bright coins of light that traveled the rock wall across from her. The sun was at mid-morning. It did not care about any of them. She had been running since before first light. She had been running since the moment Vas and his men came over the ridge above her family's camp, and she had seen what they were doing, and she had left the camp, because there was nothing to be done for what was being done there, and she had run into the arroyo, and her side had caught on a branch of mesquite that she had not seen in the dark, and the branch had opened her, and she had run another quarter-mile before the blood made the ground soft under her feet and told her to stop. The Lakota came down the switchback trail on a gray horse, and Vas heard the hooves and turned, and the gun came up off her ribs, and Vas said something she could not fully translate, but understood by its pitch and its shape. The kind of thing a man says when he wants another man to understand who owns what ground he is standing on. The Lakota dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, and the horse stood, and the Lakota walked down into the arroyo, and he put himself between her and Vas without looking at Vas and without looking at her. He stood there the way a stone stands. He did not speak. Vas spoke. The Lakota did not answer. One of the men on the ridge moved his horse sideways and looked behind him to the high ground and looked back and said something to the other man, and then they were both looking at something on the ridge she could not see from where she lay with the caliche under her cheek, and the blood making it slow accounting in the dirt. Vas looked up. His jaw worked. He looked at the Lakota's back, and at whatever was on the ridge behind, and he looked at his gun, and made a calculation she could read from where she lay. He holstered the gun and said something with a different quality to it, the sound of a man declining something he has not been offered, and he and his two riders went up out of the arroyo, and the hoofbeats went north and thinned into the distance and were gone. The Lakota turned and looked at her then. He had a face that had been in weather. He was not young and not old. He picked up Vas's rifle from where it lay in the dirt and he set it aside, out of reach of both of them, and he knelt beside her and looked at the wound in her side. "Do it quickly, cowboy," she said. "I won't scream." He did not do anything quickly. He pulled the torn cloth back from the wound, and he looked at it for a long time, and she looked at the sky past his shoulder, and the sky was the color of something that had never been touched. Then he opened the bag at his hip and took out a folded square of hide soaked in something that smelled of cedar, and something else she had no name for, and he pressed it against the opening in her side, and she felt the cold of it go through her, and then the sting that came after the cold, and she turned her head away and fixed her eyes on a broken silver concho lying in the dust near her hand. The silver had gone gray with dirt. She counted its points. There were 9, and the 9th was broken short. He pressed the compress down and took her hand, and set it over the compress, and pressed her hand down over his. "Hold," he said. That was all he said. She held. He cut strips from a piece of clean hide in his bag, and he worked the binding around her torso, and she lifted herself on one elbow to allow it, and her teeth came together, and she kept her eyes on the concho and counted its points again. He bound the wound the way a man binds a thing he intends to keep. He was neither rough nor careful. He worked the way a man works who has done a thing enough times to know what it requires and no more than that. When it was done, he sat back on his heels and looked at her. She looked at the concho, 8 good points and 1 broken. He put his hands under her and lifted her, and she did not fight him. She had decided not to fight him before he had touched her. She had made that decision while the gun was still against her ribs and the blood was still going into the dirt, and she had made it with the clarity of a woman who has learned to spend what she has on things that can be won. He set her across the gray horse's back and mounted behind her, and took the rifle from the dirt as they passed it, and slung it across his back, and they rode up out of the arroyo and north, along the mesa rim, and the desert opened around them, and was indifferent to her in the way it was indifferent to everything, the way the sky is indifferent to the birds that move through it. She watched the concho until the arroyo curved, and it was gone. She woke to the smell of sage smoke and the sound of horses, and did not know where she was. Then she knew. She was in a camp she had not been in before, a Lakota camp set in a hollow at the base of the mesa, where the wind off the high rock came straight down at night and flattened the fire. Someone had put a buffalo robe over her in the night, and the robe was thick and smelled of wood smoke and horse and something else, something she associated with men who do not require much from the world and therefore have not spent themselves on it. She lay still and looked at the sky above the hollow's rim, and the sky was the pale gray of river clay near dusk, and she took an accounting of her body the way she did each morning. What worked and what did not, what would serve her and what she would have to manage around. The compress was still bound to her side, and the binding was still tight, and her side told her what it thought of the situation, and she told it she understood. A young Lakota rider came in from the south, and his horse was dark with sweat, and the horse's breathing was the breathing of an animal that has been asked for everything. The rider spoke to the Lakota chief, and the chief listened with his face unchanged, and then he began speaking to the men nearest him in a low voice, and they moved without confusion, and without waiting to be told a thing twice. She had seen leaders who needed noise to move people. She had seen leaders unlike this. They were striking the camp. A woman she did not know came and crouched beside her and helped her to sit and gave her a clay cup of water, and she drank it without speaking, and the woman did not require her to speak. The woman brought a pony, a small red dun, and helped her to mount, and she put her leg over and sat the pony and waited for her side to tell her its opinion, and it did, and she breathed and accepted it. They rode north by northwest in a column along the base of the mesa. She rode near the rear where she could see the length of the column, and from there she could see the chief moving along it, checking the pace, adjusting. Near the front, a child of perhaps 5 years sat a small pony that shied sideways at a jackrabbit that came bolting from the grass, and the child went sideways with the pony and was going to fall. And the chief was there, before she had finished seeing it happen, and he caught the child by the arm and set her straight on the pony's back. One motion, and the child looked up at him, and he was already looking ahead, and they continued, and he said nothing about it to anyone. She watched him from the rear of the column. She had learned to watch men the way she watched weather, for the signs of what was coming, the thing that was underneath the surface of what showed. There was always something underneath. She had learned this before she had words for the learning. A man who was careful in front of others had learned the value of being seen to be careful. She catalogued what she saw and held it separate from what she thought about it and kept watching. At the river crossing she could have gone. The river was wide and shallow, and the crossing was long enough to make noise if she turned away from it, but she was on the downstream side, and the column was focused upstream, and the far bank was thick willow and box elder, and the willows were dense enough to disappear into. Her pony was sound. The water was knee-deep and running slow. She held the pony at the water's edge and looked at the far bank. She crossed with the column. She did not look back at the willows. In the new camp, they picketed the horses in a draw and built the fires small, and she sat near one of them and stared into it. He came and crouched near the fire and held out a strip of dried meat without ceremony, and she took it from his hand, and he stood and walked away without waiting to see what she did with it. She looked at the meat. She looked at the stitching on the saddle blanket that had been put beneath her, red and black thread in a pattern that repeated, and then changed, and then repeated in a new way. She ran her finger along one row of stitches. She ate the meat. The fire popped and a spark rose and died. She ran her finger along another row. The sky to the west went from orange to the color of a bruise, and the stars came out one at a time the way they do when the sky is very clear. He was fletching arrows at the fire's edge when she came, and sat across from him without asking. He did not stop working. His hands sorted the feathers, hawk feathers by their look, and set the notch and wound the sinew around the shaft in the tight spiral that holds. She had watched her grandfather do this. She watched him. The fire was between them, and the wind came from the northwest with the cold in it that meant the high country had already lost its summer. The other fires in camp burned low, and the voices near them were low, and the night settled over the desert the way it does when there is no moon completely, without stages. Then the wind brought the smell of the storm. It came from the northwest as the cold had come, and it had a metal smell, and the fire bent and flattened in the first gust, and she looked up at the sky, and the sky to the northwest had gone green-black above the mesa rim, the kind of green that does not arrive gently. He stood and she stood with him, and they moved to the supply cache at the edge of camp, where the hides were staked over the dried meat, and the medicine bags, and the things that could not be left to the rain. He was pulling the stakes on one side of the main hide, and she went to the other side without being asked, and she was pulling stakes before she had made a decision to pull them. The wind hit in full, and the hide went up like a sail, a great crack of leather in the dark, and she caught the edge, and her side said what it said, and she held the edge anyway and pulled it down to the ground, and he drove a stake through the corner, and they moved to the next corner, and the rain came in behind the wind. The first drops large and separate, and then all at once, the way a verdict comes. The rain made the ground smell like iron. It came straight down, and then at an angle, and then straight down again, and the cold of it went through her clothes, and she could feel each drop on her scalp, and the cold ran down her neck and into the collar of her shirt. His hands came to the rope on her side of the supply hide, and her hands were already on the rope, and they were both on it in the dark, and the rain ran off both their knuckles together. He showed her the knot his people used. His hands worked hers through it in the dark, not holding her hands but guiding them the way you teach a knot. She showed him the knot her people used. She worked his hands through it the same way. Both knots held. The hide held against the wind, and the supplies underneath stayed dry. When it was done, they stood inside the lean of the hide, and the rain hammered the leather above them, and ran off the front edge in a sheet that caught the firelight and fell white into the dark. The space between them was small and warm, with the warmth of two people who have done hard work together, and the warmth did not require explanation. She turned to look at the supply boxes behind them, and there on top of one of them was a small moccasin, child-sized, beaded in blue and white on the toe, set there by someone or left by someone or blown there by the wind before it arrived. She did not know. She looked at it, and the looking took time she had not planned to spend. The beads were the small round kind that catch firelight, lapis blue and bone white, and her son had liked those beads. He had been 4 years old when the cavalry came, and he had been wearing moccasins she had made herself with beads that same blue. She had not seen those moccasins after that morning. She held this moccasin in both hands in the lean of the hide, while the rain came down outside, and she did not move for a time that she could not have measured. He was looking at her. She knew it without turning. She set the moccasin on the supply box deliberately, as a person sets a thing down when they have finished with it. She did not pick it up again. She turned, and he was looking at her, and his face held what it held, and he did not look away, and she did not ask him to, and there was a long moment in which the rain was the only thing that spoke. She went back to the fire. She lay down near it and pulled the robe over her, and for a long time she listened to the rain on the hides and the sound of the camp settling into sleep around her, and she looked at the underside of the smoke-dark hide above her. Then she closed her eyes. She slept, and she did not wake until morning. In the morning, he saddled her horse before his own. She saw it from where she sat eating with the others, the fire gone to coals now in the early light. He did not look over to see if she noticed. He lifted the saddle the way he lifted everything, without announcement, and set it and reached under for the cinch and ran the latigo through and drew it up. She watched his hands work. She ate. They rode east toward the high spring, he and she alone, with the rest of the camp at their work in the camp behind them. The order of things, him choosing to take her along, her agreeing to go, had happened with fewer words than she had used for most mornings. He had come to where her horse was picketed and put the water skins over the saddle. She had stood and followed. The desert in the early light was the color of old copper, the east still holding some of the deep amber before the sun got above the horizon and made everything ordinary. The sage was silver. Their shadows ran long to the west and moved with them across the ground. The trail climbed by switchbacks into the red rock country, where the mesa folded back on itself, and the stone went from red to orange to a pale yellow at the top, and the spring came out of a crack in the cliff face into a stone basin below it. The basin was deep and clean, and the overflow ran down the rock face and vanished into the ground. Someone had made the basin, or time had made it, and the difference did not matter to the water. He showed her the Lakota word for water. He said it and she said it, and he did not correct her. He showed her the word for horse and for sky, and she said each one back, and he listened to her and only corrected once. She gave him the Apache word for a thing that has no going back, the word her grandfather had used for decisions made at the edge of a cliff, and he turned the word in his mouth and looked at her, and she told him what it meant. He was quiet a moment with it. Then he said it again, the way she had said it, and she did not correct him because there was nothing to correct. They watered the horses side by side, and the horses drank with the patience and the contentment of animals that have had enough of what they need for now, and want nothing more than this moment with the cold water and the rock and the silence. The water came out of the cliff cold as winter, cold as what was under the ground, and ran over the lip of the basin and down the red stone, and was gone into the desert. She had a question that had been in her since the arroyo, and she asked it here at the spring, where everything was simple. She asked why he had come through Apache territory alone. He looked at the place where the water came out of the rock. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he has looked at before and found something in worth looking at again. Then he said, "My father made an agreement with your grandfather's people. Someone has to remember it." He did not say anything else. She did not ask. A hawk was working the thermals above the mesa, riding the heat that came up off the red rock, turning in the long, slow circles that cost a hawk almost nothing. She watched the hawk. She watched it when the feeling got too large for her to hold while also looking at him, and the hawk turned and turned, and the sky above it was without limit, and the hawk did not know about its own beauty and did not require anyone to name it. He cupped water from the basin in his palm and held his hand out. She looked at his palm. She looked at the water lying in it. She leaned and drank from his hand, and the water was cold enough to ache in her back teeth, and she drank slowly and did not hurry, and when she was done she straightened and he lowered his hand, and the last of the water ran off his fingers and fell into the dust. They filled the water skins and tied them to the saddles and rode back the way they had come. On the ride back, she rode beside him instead of behind him, and neither of them said anything about that either. Vas came in the blue hour before dawn with his 2 men, and a fourth she had not seen before. She woke to the sound of horses, and the sound told her what it was before the sleep had fully left her. 4 horses, coming from the south, moving with the particular quality of horses ridden by men who are not trying to be quiet because they do not think quiet is necessary. She was on her feet with the robe still across her shoulders, and she was moving before the alarm went through the rest of the camp. She went to the supply cache, and she knew where the bow was and where the quiver was, and she took them both, and she went up the red rock behind the camp, by the way she had found 3 nights before when she could not sleep, and had walked the perimeter in the dark as she had walked the perimeter of every camp she had ever slept in, because that habit does not leave you. It only waits. She was on the rock above the flat before Vas brought his torch into the open. By the torchlight she could see the 2 Lakota boys Vas's man had by their collars, boys of 10 or 11 years who had been sleeping at the edge of camp, and were now awake and being held at the edge of the torchlight, and the boys made no sound, and she noted that, and held it separate from the other things she was knotting. Vas sat his horse at the center, and the torch was in his left hand and his right was on his thigh, and she watched that right hand. Kohana rode out from the camp on the gray horse. He rode out alone, and he came into the torchlight, and he sat his horse between Vas and the camp, and he did not speak first. Voss spoke. She heard the shape of it. Apache woman, she heard, the words she could pick out and worth money and step aside, and Kohana sat his horse and did not step aside and said nothing. Voss spoke again. His right hand moved to his belt. She tracked that hand and she knocked the arrow and she found the white stone in the dirt below, a piece of quartz she had seen catch the torchlight, 3 feet in front of Voss's horse's left forefoot. She put the arrow in the ground between the stone and the hoof, and the sound of it was a short, sharp sound, and Voss's horse shied and Voss grabbed for the reins with both hands, and in that moment Kohana came off the gray horse. She had not seen a man move that way. She had seen fast men. He crossed the ground between them before Voss had the horse settled, and he had Voss's gun hand at the wrist, and the gun was in the dirt, and Voss was in the dirt beside it. And then Voss was standing again and looking at the gun that was no longer where a gun should be. The man who had been holding the boys let them go, and the boys ran into the darkness toward camp. The 4th man turned his horse and rode south and did not look back. Voss looked at the gun in the dirt. He looked at Kohana. He looked at the rock above, and he could not see her because she was above the light and in the dark. Kohana pointed north. Voss looked north and he looked again at the rock, and he made his calculation the same as he had in the arroyo, and it came out the same, and he began walking north. His 2 remaining men walked behind him, and the torchlight went with them, and the flat went dark. Kohana looked up at the rock. She had the arrow still in her hand, and she was touching the fletching, running her thumb along the edge of the feather, back and forth, back and forth. She climbed down. The rock was cold, and the handholds she had memorized 3 nights ago were where she remembered them, and she came down to the flat, and Kohana was standing there in the dark. There had been a moment, while Voss's 2nd man was raising his rifle at Kohana's back, when she had swung the bow and drawn and been 3 pounds of pull from losing, and the man had lowered the rifle before she had to make the decision she had already made. She did not examine this. She looked at Kohana standing in the dark, and she held the bow out and he took it, and their fingers did not touch, and she turned and walked back to the fire. She sat near the coals and put her hands in her lap and looked at them. The boys had come back into the firelight, and the camp had woken around the event, and she could hear voices, and the settling of people who have had a fright and found the other side of it. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs. She looked at the fletching of the unused arrow she had carried back from the rock without thinking, and she set it down in the dirt beside her. She had been 3 pounds of pull away. She sat with that for a long time. By mid-morning, the burned smell had gone out of the air, and the desert returned to what it was. The sky was high and pale and nearly white at the horizon, and the light lay flat across the mesa without drama. The horses in the remuda moved along the picket line, and the sounds they made were the sounds of animals that have had water and are not afraid. She sat at the edge of the camp away from the morning's activity, and she cleaned the wound herself, unwound the binding, and cleaned it with the cedar preparation she had asked for from the woman who had helped her mount that first day. And she examined what was happening under the skin, and what was happening was what she had hoped, and she rebound it clean and tight. The rider came from the south before midday. His horse was a blue roan she knew, one of her brother Nolly's horses, a horse her brother had owned since it was a yearling and had kept sound through country that used horses hard. She knew the horse before she could see the rider's face, and by the time the rider was close enough to speak, she had already understood the shape of what was coming. He pulled up. He said her name. She said yes. He said Nolly had sent him. He said her people were camped in the valley 2 days south, Nolly and the others who had made it out, and that there was a horse for her and food for the ride, and that Nolly had sent him as soon as they knew where she had gone. He said Nolly's name again as if the name itself were an argument. She stood. She walked to where her horse was picketed on the north line. The horse turned its head and looked at her and went back to the dry grass at its feet. She took hold of the halter. She stood there. The light moved on the rock walls. A cactus wren worked the needles of a prickly pear at the camp's edge, moving with the quick certainty of a creature that knows where it is and what it is doing there. The rider from her brother's camp sat his horse in the sun and waited, and the horse stood with its hip dropped the way horses stand when they are content to wait. She unbuckled the halter from the post. She held it in her hands. The leather was warm from the sun and supple, and she stood with it and looked at nothing in particular for a time that was longer than she had planned to stand there. She hung the halter back on the post. She lifted her saddle from the rail and carried it back to the supply line, and she set it with the other saddles, and she picked up the saddle pad and laid it on the pad pile, and she walked back through the camp toward the fire. Kohana was sitting near the central fire with the bridle across his knee, and the all moving in short, careful strokes through the leather on the cheekpiece where the stitching had pulled loose. He did not look up. She sat beside him, and there was another awl in the kit on the ground between them, and she took it, and she pulled the far side of the bridle across her own knee, and she looked at what the stitching needed, and she began on that end. He moved the leather. She moved the leather. The awl went in and came out, and the sinew drew through. The fire had burned down to coals, and the coals moved with the small wind, brightening and dimming, and the smell of the smoke was sage and cedar and the smell of the morning's coffee, long gone. Behind her she heard the roan turn. She heard the hoofbeats go south, slow at first and then finding their pace and then thinning into the distance, and then the desert taking them entirely, the way the desert takes everything it is given, without ceremony, without comment. She did not turn to watch him go. The bridle needed stitching on her side for the length of the cheekpiece, and she worked it stitch by stitch and counted them as she made them. When the last stitch was pulled tight, she knotted it and cut it and set the awl back in the kit. She did not stand up. The cactus wren called once from the prickly pear, and from somewhere farther in the scrub another one answered, and then both of them were quiet, and the only sounds were the sounds the desert makes when it has no argument with the day. The creak of a saddle somewhere in the remuda, the low movement of the wind across the mesa rim, the coals settling in the fire ring with a sound like something being put carefully down.